Thank you, Bea, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be in the company of the esteemed venerables here today. And interestingly, my daughter actually has been involved in the Changtian temple in Brisbane, so she's here today. Has been involved in the So there is a Chinese connection even with the Theravadan Buddhism. She's been involved in the International Buddhist Light movement, so that was good. So I need to say in advance, I hope you can understand my accent for a start. And it's going to be a good excuse because my Pali accent is even worse. So we'll pretend it's an Australian Pali accent. I will have these PowerPoint slides available, so I'm going to cover some areas very quickly and some in a lot of depth. It's always hard doing these presentations because of the audience. So I made an assumption that people would have some knowledge of Buddhism. so that would be a good start. So I'll go through the background and where I come from. I'm going to talk about a concept that might be a little bit unfamiliar, ableism. Okay. A very quick view of Buddhist views of the body. On one PowerPoint slide, which is a bit ridiculous, but anyway. I'll talk about the Four Sightings and the notion of Samvega. A little bit on the Four Noble Truths, dependent arising, and I'll spend probably a bit more time on the issue of karma and Buddhism, because that's been an area that's been really misunderstood both outside Buddhism and within Buddhist communities as well. I'm going to talk a little bit, some might say controversially, about the Buddha's body, and also looking at a very famous Arahant, which Arahants are very important in Theravada Buddhism, I guess what you would call in English a Buddhist saint maybe, who was a disabled man. Okay, so I'm not a Buddhist studies scholar. When I saw the speakers, I kind of got a bit nervous. I have been studying Buddhist studies for several years, more as an activity, as an extension of my own faith, and across the range of Buddhist traditions. Although my own background, I'm actually from a Scottish background, but also a Sri Lankan background. So you could say I'm a result of the global melting pot, so be able to bring these, and I have a Chinese daughter, so I really wanted to look at particularly I am an adjunct professor in disability studies at the University of Kelaniya in Sri Lanka, and one of the things that surprised me is that the majority of disabled people in the world are in Buddhist majority countries, which is really interesting. And yet very little work has been done at the scholarly level or at the level of practice, Dharma practice, looking at cultural attitudes to disability through a Buddhist lens, or many Buddhist lenses. As you know, Buddhism is a very diverse tradition. And it's interesting because probably in terms of Christianity, probably work has been done at a doctrinal level as well as a practice level in local church communities. In Christianity, probably for the last 20-25 years. So we've got lots of work to do. It's a really ripe area for research, but also practice, how we actually make our Dharma communities inclusive to disabled people. So obviously I am a disabled person. My background's disability studies, and I do Sri Lankan studies research. Currently I'm working on the concept of shame, how shame might be experienced by mothers who have disabled children, and also disabled people, and how disability affects concepts of reciprocalness and family obligations. Okay, so it's probably the easiest. And I'm venturing, I underline this in my PowerPoint, venturing into Buddhist studies. Sometimes, like with all professions, there's a little bit of elitism. So sometimes people say, well, how can you do Buddhist studies if you don't know the original languages and stuff? And that's why you befriend people like Bea. I think the important thing is that there's a multiplicity of Buddhist traditions. So even if we talk about Theravada Buddhism, there are all sorts of schools within countries, and there are obviously several countries, and so I think that's really important. And why I say it is important is constantly I am up against this notion that Buddhism has bad things to say about disabled people. I mean, apart from the fact that it's factually incorrect, it's also an incorrect statement. What Buddhism? You know, and disability is really, really broad. So I thought I would focus on a little bit on Theravada Buddhism, looking at doctrinal issues and some of the cultural paradigms. I have a non-medical view of disability. So studies in ableism, which I'll spend more time on in a minute, talks about the notion of what does it mean in our communities, the notion of becoming abled, becoming perfect. And then who are the people that fall away? Sometimes we call them disabled people, sometimes we call them deviants, sometimes we call them perverts. There's all sorts of, sometimes, there's all sorts of names, and you only need to look at the Vinaya in terms of its rules of who's excluded from the Sangha, and there's all sorts of kind of really unusual kind of notions of deviancy, from obviously traditional physical disability to people with tattoos and all sorts of things. Okay, so let's move through, because I don't want this to be overly academic, but one of the things, I guess it is a methodological issue, and there's a concept of reading against the grain. And this really works well as a methodology, because you might be aware in Buddhism, the Buddha himself was referred to as a person who swam against the current. You know, so and going against the current, and the Buddha in his lifetime, he caused trouble. Actually, he disturbed a lot of norms. He criticised in a very gentle, loving way the way social organisation was undertaken. I mean, things around, for example, caste and social division within India. So reading against the grain, in many ways you can read texts in all sorts of ways. Reading against the grain really looks at what things are missing in texts. You know, what if we made characters or messages that sort of are on the periphery or on the outside, made them central to our analysis? What is marginalised in a text? So that's what I'll be doing today. Now the second slide before we get into the meaty gritty, and it probably is the most academic. I haven't changed it in terms of the academic language, but I will explain it. Ableism. Actually, ableism is not actually about disability. It's about us. It's about this concept of perfection. What does it mean to become abled? You know, the message of the fountain of youth, the notion that we will have bodies that don't break down. I was reading some science magazines the other day that in the future we may have bodies that have 5 or 6 year warranties, and once they wear out we can take them back and get a upgrade maybe. So ableism is this notion that in fact that there can be perfection in the world, and so I'll go through these definitions. So when I look at ableism, I look at, and you can see it's very Buddhist. In fact, some people when they kind of look at this, they think, oh, this is a bit suspicious, and it's not read for a Buddhist audience. A system of causal relations. That's because actually the doctrine of dependent origination, actually I use in my own secular work. It's a bit sneaky really, but that's because I believe it actually is the truth, and it can work for sociological studies as well. So a system of causal relations about how life is ordered. And that ordering of life produces different processes and systems that entitle some people in our society. Some people get rewarded and other people get excluded. And it's not just people, it's also other sentient beings. Why do we have a ranking of sentient beings in this world? And I'm thinking this week about those 2 monkeys that were cloned. You know, what is going to happen to them in their lives from this point on? And causality often fosters conditions of microaggression. People get attacked and get abused and get invalidated. People internalise a sense of self-worth or a lack of self-worth. And ableist systems involve, I guess, differentiating, dividing people, dividing groups, higher and lower, ranking, and prioritising people. So there's a couple of things there, a few things to digest, but I think the final bit is this notion of ablement. What is the process of becoming abled? Okay, becoming abled. You think about enabled. Okay, and this will come clearly. Now, one of the things I've done in this presentation is I've literally taken stuff straight from the sutras or sutras. I mean, this is the great stuff. This is really old gems. The Dharma is old, and it's saying stuff that was written thousands of years ago, that speaks to the contemporary situation, and from my perspective, is a source of great philosophical and analysis about knowledge, but also in terms of methods. So here we have, and I'm going to read this out and just speak to it really, is when an untaught run-of-the-mill person, this is an interesting thing in English translation, that comes up actually through the sutras, this notion of a run-of-the-mill person, you know, it's himself subject to illness, not beyond illness, sees another who is ill, is horrified, humiliated and disgusted, oblivious to, and this is the interesting thing, oblivious to himself that he too is subject to illness, not beyond illness. And if I, who am subject to illness, not beyond illness, were to be horrified and humiliated and disgusted on seeing another person who is ill, that would not be fitting for me. As I noticed this, the healthy person's intoxication with health entirely dropped away. So what I think what's really interesting is, I mean, you can spend, you could spend a whole day on this one text, meditating, discussing this, is this notion of relationship. And in fact, actually, instead of looking at the ill person, or in this case, the disabled person, as other, as totally foreign from oneself, actually, the disabled person in many ways is a mirror to one's own self. There is actually more of a commonality going on. So the disabled in the sutras, it talks about not treating, not treating people different from oneself as the other, but actually using this opportunity of difference to draw oneself in to dialogue and conversation. So actually using difference, human difference, as a magnet to draw people in. But also this alienation. And I think the Dharma in many ways acts as an elixir, as a tonic to the seduction of ableism, the seduction that of health. And one of the themes that comes up in the sutras is this kind of notion of the intoxication of health. Okay, and we'll look at what health actually means. This kind of notion of being intoxicated with, having the perfect body, having the perfect mind, perfect relationships, perfect assets, you name it. Okay, so again, very quickly, Buddhist understanding of embodiment, and again, we could do a lot more work on this. We haven't got the time. Most of you should know this anyway, to some extent, that there's no mind-body split. It's very different from a Western notion. The concept of non-self, that the human person, as we would call it in English, is made up of 5 skandhas, which are in a constant process of change, arising and decay, and mental processes and physical processes coming together. So it's a dynamic process, and not a static entity. And there's been lots of Dharma talks and lots of academic writings about the Buddhist concept of the self and what it actually means. And I think there's an elusiveness that's there, but clearly I think the message that needs to be put out is it demolishes the idea of a static individual identity that moves through time. And this is really important when we talk about multi-life narratives later. Okay. I think the important bit that Morozic, and if you haven't read her work, it's amazing. Bodies are rarely neutral, and they are formed on the basics of ethics that they view. Okay. I'm not going to read out this slide. I'm going to talk about this. Hopefully, most of you, as adults or children, know the story of the Four Sightings. Okay. When the Buddha, and the Buddha's interesting in terms of his historical story. The Buddha actually, whilst he was privileged in terms of economics, actually started off life as a man who was institutionalised. And this really speaks to the disability story. He was effectively and I don't want to overplay it, he was effectively incarcerated in a palace. He wasn't in a torture chamber, but certainly he was in a palace and he was incarcerated. And, modern psychology talks about how institutionalisation and deprivation affects people's mindsets and constructions of reality. I think this story is, and again I'm writing on this story has been told, it's kind of well known. What I'm really interested in is what's done with this story, because this story is a story that could be read in a range of ways. It could be used to get people to part with money because they feel sorry for people. You feel sorry for aged people and disabled people and people who are dead who can't get their funeral expenses met. But actually, the story is quite profound because it's more about what goes on in the Buddha's own discernment and reflection. And I think one of the things that comes across in this story is that Buddha being shocked with the stark reality of how things are. One of the things that's interesting when you try to explain Buddhism is often I go back to this story and the Four Noble Truths. And I figure if you can kind of get those right, everything else gets a wee bit clearer, And I think there is this notion then without overcomplicating, one of the critiques in Buddhism is the critique of thinking from, I guess, the reference to I always being the subject of thinking. In Pali that's known as papancha, which is this kind of notion of conflicted proliferating thought. This idea where you start and say, what did I do to deserve this? What is wrong with me? Why can't I do this and do that? And you can see the kind of obsession is always I, okay? The interesting thing with the Buddha's experience, and again, I'm writing a piece on Samvega and how it applies to disability, is instead of the Buddha feeling like he wanted to slash his wrists in seeing this and being really distressed. You can imagine not ever having seen this kind of level of suffering, and it was very stark and being exposed. Instead of saying, look, this is all terrible, I'm going off to the pub and I'm going to go and have a few drinks and drown my sorrows, which would be quite a okay reaction, I reckon, when you see these kind of things, a real shock. What he did is that he had a complex range of feelings. That notion of experiencing simultaneously, of course he was shocked, upset, dismayed and alienated, but and realising then that what he thought was the meaning of life, that things would go well and things would be perfect, wasn't necessarily the case. But this notion then of moving through that to this idea then that actually this is how things are, and it's moving from that point of recognition that this is how things are, and you can move out to that with a sense of serenity and confidence. There is a way out of this, and I think that's really important because often we have this view in the disability community and the general community, and you see this often when crime reports come up. It's better to be dead than disabled. This kind of what we call the personal tragedy theory of disability. There could be nothing more bloody awful than, I've had people in the street come up to me, strangers, who'll say, if I was like you, I would want to commit suicide. The very fact that people even have these conversations, with you. But that is quite a notion. So that notion then, that the Buddha then looked at, well, how can we find a way out of this meaningless cycle? Okay. Again, really moving through with this particular quote is, again, this kind of notion of loss. We all experience loss is part of a natural part of existence. And again, the quote, could you face the prospect of spending the rest of your life in a wheelchair? Well, actually, one thing about human beings is we are great adapters. We're extraordinary adapters. As the Venerable Gunaratana has actually said here, is that pain is inevitable, but suffering is not. So it's how we actually respond to that. I want to start moving into some specifics here. And again, one of the things in my work is disabled people are very well studied. There's not much we don't know about disabled people in the world, although I must say the voice of disabled people often has been marginalised in particular. But what I'm really interested in is this intoxication issue. How is it, particularly in the West, not only the West, but particularly in the West, how are we conned? How are we conned and deluded that it is actually possible to have a satisfied life through materialism? It's really interesting. Conned into believing that there are all sorts of things we can do with technologies now to defy the idea that we are decaying and aging is normal. Yeah, I mean, we have cosmetic surgery. Actually, where I come from in Australia, the Gold Coast, it's the boom capital of cosmetic surgery. It's probably because also it's one of the biggest areas for skin cancer as well. We also have now, you may not have heard about it, cosmetic neurology, which is another whole field, which is about producing drugs that make us smarter and more alert. I think students often want this, remember things more. Yeah, but and the military is very interested in these things. Military things like more compliant, you know. So this kind of intoxication, the fact that, you know, there's cryogenics now, the fact of, well, they can't do anything now for us, we'll cut our heads off and stick them in a freezer, and maybe further down the line we can be regenerated. And each of us, and why do we often get sorrow and suffering? Because we fall short. We are constantly chasing normative, ableist shadows instead of letting it be. Why am I not fitting in? Why am I not normal? And we're all victims of this. I mean, the very fact that I still insist on dyeing my hair because it's actually grey through half of it, you know. But, you know, and even though intellectually I know that men can get away with grey hair, you know, but so there's all sorts of complexities. There's gender, there's expectations, there's all these kinds of things. So ableism looks at the kind of notion of the intoxication with youth. What does that mean? Intoxications with health. And I think this is really interesting from a Buddhist perspective, because actually the Buddhist idea about what a satisfied life should look like, and the Buddha's recipe or instructions for leading a life in the here and now, humanistic Buddhism, that can create a good mind, actually flies in the face of some very dominant forces in the world. And I think this is where the social justice aspect happens. I'm writing a paper at the moment on the concept of health, nothing to do with Buddhism, but you would be really interested in this because in 1947, the World Health Organisation, which is an organ of the United Nations, has a lot of power, they came up with a definition of health. And I thought I would just quickly, it's not on the PowerPoint slide, but just mention it. Because actually I think it stands in total contrast to a Buddhist ethos. It's interesting. So health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely an absence of disease and infirmity. And some of the criticisms are that this notion of health is static, but this notion that it's possible to have a state of complete, somehow there'll be this perfect person in all these domains, well-being, physical domain and mental domains, right? Interestingly, you know, one of the biggest, and there's big fights at the moment, there's big debates, should we revise this definition of health since 1947? It's not working. And the pharmaco-industrial complex, lovely academic language, isn't it? In other words, the pharmaceutical industry, right, who write all the standards and codes, and you've got to have codes and guidelines, otherwise you've got no drugs to sort of scale them and justify them. As time has gone on, they've actually narrowed the definition of what it means to be normal. Okay, narrowed it. You know, we now have tests letting you know of diseases that may or may not happen. You didn't even know they existed, but they might exist. Okay, there's a whole range of areas, and so what actually happens is that is the narrowing of normalcy, and increasingly we have a change globally of larger and larger abnormal, unhealthy populations. Okay, so it's really quite interesting in this area. What has this got to do with Buddhism? I think the fact is that the Buddhist critique of the intoxication of health, intoxication with ableism, the notion of perfection, can provide new areas of critique, new paths to cross. And again, it's there in these small little gems of wisdom from the sutras: subject to birth, subject to aging, subject to death, and we have to keep reminding people these things happen, even though we know they happen. Run-of-the-mill people, the common person, are repelled by those who suffer from from that to which they are subject. So it's almost like we're warning signs. This could happen to you if you don't watch it, And if I were to be repelled by being subject to these things, it would not be fitting for me living as I do. Okay, let's move through. That's again another, I'll just keep moving through here. I mean, again, as these kind of texts, if you're working with young children, teenagers, a text like this would be really something to kind of do some meditation around, to do some workshopping around. It's really simple language, but oh my goodness, each line you could probably do an hour with, Again, because most people know this, I'm going to very quickly go for this. So the notion that, I think the fact of impermanence is something that we really need to talk about a bit more, and the fact that actually we all are living in changeable, dynamic bodies. Okay? So this kind of thing of holding on to, the suffering comes to the holding on to this kind of notion. It's a shame and dukkha, and it's mistranslation. It's mistranslation of I use the word unsatisfactoriness in here, but this notion of suffering, I think, becomes quite distortive. So kind of going into that tunnel of what it means to be unsatisfactory. I think one message that we need to take out is that, again, aging, decay, illness, vulnerability and death are normal. They're norms. They're not aberrations. They're not exceptions. And in fact, the denial of a permeable body, in fact, is a perversion. Okay, well, I actually might move through because I really want to get onto the karma stuff. Okay. As I said, this is quite a lot to get through. So the thing is, karma is it's really misunderstood. I looked at some advertising around marketing for karma. You can use karma for all sorts of things: payback, chewing gum. You name it. But it's interesting. It's also misunderstood in Buddhism, to the point that, like Sri Lanka is a Theravada Buddhist country. The national policy on disability itself contains a statement that, due to Buddhist doctrinal beliefs of karma, that has led to oppressive attitudes to disabled people. I'm just giving you a précis here. So this is just kind of just assumed that Buddhism has these kind of views about karma, and they cause problems for disabled people. Firstly, as an academic, where's your sources? Where's your verification? That's never included. But also the fact is that actually there are all sorts of interpretations of karma, and I'm sure those of you who are Buddhist studies researchers would be aware. There's just so many books talking about, even within one tradition. So I think the important bit here is that karma, one of the things I do when I work with groups is to unpack it, to look at volitional action. I think the fact is that karma is often viewed in a very simplistic way, predetermined. It's transactional. If you do this, this will happen to you. And I think the other issue when we talk about karma is we need to be really bringing in this concept of the self and the concept of non-self. And what does the concept of non-self mean in terms of multi-life narratives? As a layperson, one of the things I was thinking of, well, actually, if we haven't got a sense of the I in Buddhism, then we haven't got a sense of the possessive, the notion of what we call in Western thought possessive individualism, that you own something. The I owns something. And in fact, karma instead should speak more to relationality and looking at the production. What does karma actually produce? Okay, because I see karma certainly in terms of an energy of some sort, something that's being produced, transfer, a flow. It's not a system of justice or retribution or fatalism. And I have to be really careful and a bit political about this. I have been watching a number of YouTube videos over the years with various Asian monks, we'll just leave it at that, who in the translation, sometimes they're speaking their own language, sometimes it's in English, but the word retribution is often used. And I find in English it's, retribution for me is like having a big jackboot. It's punishment. It conjures up all sorts of. It's really a scary word, actually. I think retribution. It kind of almost denotes the notion of punishment, good and evil, and fear, so what it does is, and this notion, and I there are videos on the web where it is said that you are a disabled person because this is a retributive effect of some terrible thing that you've done in a previous life, and this is from the Sangha. Okay. So what I would like to say, and I think it's important to call this out, but this is where we need research to work with the Sangha in all our traditions, because actually the different sutras say different things. There's not a consistency of view about this. So we need to be engaged in critical studies around this. Because actually, with this notion of retribution or fatalism, it's not even just the disabled person, it affects their whole family. Whole families get ostracised. We need to look at co-responsibility. So I've just put a couple of things here, and I may not get through all my PowerPoint slides. In fact, I'm unlikely to, but that's why you do slides, so you at least have a little gift to take away. I mean, karmic narratives. In Sri Lanka, most people don't, up until very recently, don't get to read the sutras directly. Many volumes in Sinhala were only just recently published, so the masses haven't had necessarily direct access. Where do they know about Dharma? It's from the monks' teachings and from small cut-down stories. It's like I explain this to Christians, it's like the Jesus Bible stories. And in the Sri Lankan context, it's the Jataka tales. And if you want to have bad nightmares, you can read those. Because there's some great stories in it, but there's also some really hideous stories. And they're popular legends. There's phantoms, there's heroes, and obviously moral lessons come out about that. And again, they imbued particular kind of cosmological frameworks, but they also tell us what it means to be morally abled. What does it mean to be an upstanding person, and what is the opposite of that? And again, I'm just really flicking through these things here. I might just do 2 more slides, B, and just leave it as that. And as I said to you, I mean, these are here, and I'm happy for people to write to me and continue the conversation as part of our dialogue. I think the notion is disability, generally speaking, not all disabilities. I mean, disability is such a long, broad category about what you would call disability. It's very cultural, by the way, this notion of what disability means. But it usually is seen as a sign of bad karma, and this notion of karmically marked bodies. What I haven't put on the slide here, which is concerning, is this notion of bad karma events. Then there are karmically marked nations or populations. And this is a real problem. And we do have a responsibility. I mean, I've heard stories in the Theravada tradition. I can be critical of one's own tradition here. Where people have asked Thai monks questions about why Jews were killed in the Holocaust, and you get this kind of really outrageous offensive stuff that Jews as a group in a previous life must have did this, and this is this retribution kind of discourse. Or in Sri Lanka, why was there a tsunami? Why have we had a 30-year war? So this kind of whole notion of whole populations being karmically marked or disabled. Ayakema, lovely German Theravadan Buddhist nun, amazing woman. I had the great privilege when she was live to go to her meditation classes. Talks about the fact that, we forget that karma is impartial. Yes, there are certain tendencies from our past lives, but most things that actually happen to us are happening in our present life. I think there are a whole lot of areas we need to do research. So today's call really also is for discussion, dialogue and research to look at, for example, what is the relationship between social karma and why some groups in our community are privileged and others others aren't. The notion of karma and right and wrong thinking, you know, this is very important because in many of our countries, governments don't respond with social justice interventions because they believe that that would be interfering in the natural order of things. Okay, I want to finish with one more slide. I'm not going to do... I'll just quickly walk through the slide just so you know what I've got here. There's some real gems. This is the first time this research has been presented in table form. But you can use this. In the Theravada tradition, there's all these kind of characters. So you've got the Ananda, the treasurer, you know, and it talks about what their impairment is. It talks about, from the sources, why that impairment was, you know, created. So you've got an example that this doctor intentionally blinds a woman. He's a doctor and he goes out and blinds a woman. But then it talks about other explanations as to why that doctor became blind and what the implications are. So these are kinds of really important. So we really look at the stories and we start having discussions around this. I've talked about, pretty obvious there, what the social implications of uncritically looking at karma. I wanted to finish with 2 slides. This is very controversial, but hey, I'm not here to be nice. Most traditions, Buddhism's not unique to this. We do this with all our founders. Like, you know, Jesus was basically a homeless, rough sleeper, yeah? And then we kind of make him, and he was from a Semitic culture. And if you look at Hallmark greeting cards now, he looks perfectly white and pristine, and you know, nice clothing. Good dude, eh? And the same with the Buddha. I mean, you see, and it's interesting, I would be interested in this collection about the visual portrayals of the Buddha. And there is a tradition, certainly in the Indo-Vedic Vedic tradition of, 32 marks, and in fact there's 80 minor marks of what makes a virtuous body. They're hyper-masculine, abled, and these are the benchmarks of perfection. Here we have an intoxication happening within our historical roots, yeah? The materiality of the Buddha, his life, it suddenly becomes this kind of nibbanic uber-Buddha, okay? But what I wanted to put up here, and this is the final slide, bit controversial, reading against the grain, is in fact, can we talk about a disabled Buddha? Now, I'm not willing to, meaning to offend or be sacrilegious to anybody here. But this follows a tradition within Christianity to actually look at the notion of a disabled Christ too. The reality is the Buddha had a pretty tough life before he found enlightenment. He did things which these days we would call self-harm. You know, you don't go starving yourself and come out of that with a perfect body. One of my PhD students and I started looking at this. And obviously these aren't accurate diaries of the Buddha's life, sitting there talking about each day's experience. So we only get glimpses of this. But, you know, some examples. The Buddha had a back injury, had intestinal problems, you know. The night was fast spent. The Blessed One addressed Ananda, preacher of the Sakyas, I'm not even going to say the next word, the method of training of a trainer. Here he says very human attributes. My back is aching. I like to stretch myself. Then the Blessed One folded the robe in 4, laying it stretched out, turning to the right, keeping one foot over the other, and making the lion's posture, attending to the perception of waking. And then again, he goes on, and again it's from the sutras, goes on, you know, the community of monks is free of drowsiness. I love this. Every lecturer would love to do this. Give them a Dharma talk of your own devising. Ananda to the rescue. My back aches, I'll go and rest it. I am now old, worn out, full of years, one who has traversed life's path. Being 80s, okay, there's an ageing thing here. I have reached the end of my life, just as an old cart can only be kept going by being held together with straps. So too the Tathagata's body can be kept going by bandaging it up. And I stretch this out. I actually have a statue on my desk of the reclining Buddha. And for me, actually, it's a very powerful symbol of disability and possibility. I mean, obviously there's lots worked about sacred postures and, all the different kinds of symbolism. This books are probably full of it about what the reclining Buddha it is. But a reading against the grain is a very important way of imagining things differently. I like to see it as the Buddha, he's meditating, but you know what? He's trying to get comfortable. He's got a really, really bad back. He's finding another posture. And the alternative posture is not antithetical to enlightenment, and I think that's the important aspect of this. Now, I've gone through lots of stuff. There's lots of references in there, and I think one of the reasons why I put this together, and B, thank you again for the opportunity, is if we can get even some of these sutras out there and people going back and looking at them and reading them and then having discussions and providing a new imagination. Maybe instead of disability being seen as the other, you can use it as an opportunity to be drawn into the disability experience and reject the intoxications towards health. Thank you.